This episode originally aired March 23rd, 2026. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Tess Terrible, in for Catherine Chen. I wasn't brought up religious. I was baptized in the Catholic Church when I turned 21. And since then, I've spent a lot of time thinking about the spiritual life. And for Father James Martin, living the spiritual life didn't start the day he became a Jesuit priest. Father Martin believes everyone, no matter their religion or spiritual belief, is living the spiritual life. His new book is Work in Progress, Confessions of a Busboy, Dishwasher, Caddy, Usher, Factory Worker, Bank Teller, Corporate Tool, and Priest. Today, he joins us for a conversation on living the spiritual life and discerning God's call. Let's jump into the conversation. So, Father Martin, you've written a lot about your own experience as a Jesuit priest, as well as several guides to prayer and spiritual life. I'm curious what was happening in your life that made you want to reflect on how your experiences, specifically your professional experiences, shaped you or formed you, as the Jesuits say.
Well, it's a funny story. I was writing my last book, which was on the raising of Lazarus, called Come Forth, which, somewhat heavy book. I hope people enjoyed it. And I needed a bit of a break. And so I started writing these stories about my crazy summer job experiences just to get them down on paper. And I told so many people these stories, and they seemed to find them funny. And my publisher said, well, you can't just write a book about your funny summer jobs. And I thought, well, why not? And she said, people will want more from you. So I realized I could turn it into a book about work in general and sort of my vocation story. And so it functions as a book about finding work as a kid, as a teenager in the 70s, working at GE and then GE in Stamford, Connecticut, and then entering the Jesuits. So it's about, I always say it's about finding work and finding God. Mm.
You've been hosting your podcast, The Spiritual Life, for I think about almost a year now, and I was wondering about that because you interview various individuals from inside and outside the church. You've interviewed Trappist monk Father Isaac Slater, but you've also interviewed Stephen Colbert and Whoopi Goldberg, and I've been wondering about if that experience also kind of informed this, of like learning how others have gone through spiritual formation through their various professional experiences. Did that kind of give you more insight on your own experience and kind of also inspire the book?
I would say the opposite, because the podcast came after the book was finished. And so having reflected on my own spiritual journey helped me to see, I guess, just the value of asking people about their own path, because everybody is on a different path. And I think everyone's life is a spiritual journey, whether they know it or not. And so having spent so much time with my own, I think enabled me to enter more deeply into those of my guests on the podcast.
Can you say more about that idea that everyone is on their own spiritual journey? I caught that line in your book, and I want to ask you about that.
Yeah, I know that might rankle some people who consider themselves atheists and agnostics, and I'm not, trying to sort of force any belief on them. But I really think that, the sort of life's journey is a life to try to understand, who God is calling you to be, who God is calling us to be. And, ultimately that ends with union with God right at the end of our lives. But I think that, everything for me as a Jesuit is spiritual, right? And that includes not simply things that happen within the walls of a church or, reading the Bible or praying, but nature, relationships, family, work, right? And so we're all on this kind of spiritual journey to understand ourselves, to understand how God loves us, to experience God's love, and to give that love back to God and to other people. So, yeah, for me, it's just kind of, in a sense, I would say obvious. It may not be for everybody, but yeah, we're all on a spiritual journey.
So you talked about how you're exploring these kind of funny stories from your youth, starting with like the summer jobs that you got young. I think starting at age 13 or 14, and the readers will learn a lot in your book about kind of the mishigas you got up to
Right.
during those years. And I think there's kind of a natural curiosity of what the spiritual formation of someone, living the spiritual life looks like. And, through the process of the book, it looks like you went through a lot of your journaling in your teenage and college years. And I was wondering what that was like to, read some of your old journals and reflect on that. Because personally, when I do that, I kind of, sometimes I cringe and sometimes I'm like, yeah, that was really insightful.
Yeah, it was mostly cringe for me. It was kind of shocking. The story is that my mother, who just died a couple of weeks ago, moved out of our house where we grew up outside of Philadelphia in a town called Plymouth Meeting. And when she was moving out, I guess 10 or 12 years ago, I was cleaning up my desk. It was the same desk that I had when I was, in elementary school and junior high school. And I reached into one of the top drawers and I felt these two composition books. And I knew immediately what it was, but I'd forgotten that I'd kept a journal for the entire year of 1976 to record what I thought was going to be the monumentally historic events of the bicentennial. And there I was at age 15. And it was a shock to sort of meet yourself in an unmediated way. And I used a lot of it in the book, a lot of the, not exactly sort of repeating the journal entries, but a lot of the data and the insights and sort of how I was feeling. I think the surprise for me was that we all have an idea of what we were like and who we were when we were young and teenagers. And I think that's really sort of overlaid by a lot of, maybe sort of inaccurate memories. But to meet yourself in an unmediated way and say, this was who I was, is pretty shocking. I think I was pretty shallow. It was all about, whether or not I was popular and who liked me and how I did in school. But it was really revelatory and funny, too. There were a lot of funny stories that I was able to draw upon from those journals that I would have totally forgotten about.
Did you, looking back and reading back at those journals, from where you are now, did you start to see where God was in all of that?
Yeah, I think that was easier to see in retrospect. I always say to people, it's easier to see where God was than where God is and where God will be. There's an event that I talk about in the book when I was a young boy, sort of crossing a meadow on my way to school on a bike, where I had this experience of just kind of real sort of peace and calm and an awareness of beauty that at the time I saw as just kind of daydreaming, but now I see as a sort of early awareness of God, kind of a desire for God. That's not in the book, but there are, that's not in the journals. It's in the book. But there are other moments in the journals where I say, gosh, I think maybe I was more religious than I thought I was. But at the time, I was pretty unreflective. It's looking back that you can really see these moments of God's presence.
Yeah. As you reflect on your teenage self in the book, you do it with a lot of grace, but you also don't shy away from telling the reader about, some of what your teenage self was up to, from drinking to smoking pot and staying up all night, which is, I just see that as kind of typical teenage behavior, but it's not always something we kind of expect for someone who's a priest. What made you decide to kind of be so honest about these parts of your young adulthood?
Well, I always appreciate memoirists and writers who are honest, right? And so I think the reader deserves that. I don't drink and smoke pot and stay up all night any longer. But it was also part of what my life was like growing up. We're talking now in my college years. And I thought to leave it out would be dishonest. And also, as a joke, my friends would say, oh, you forgot about this part. And I think it's important to show that God can work through anybody's life, even, busboy, dishwasher, college student who's, getting high on the weekends, and that God can work with all that and through all of that. And also, to be honest, some of the stories were pretty funny, and I thought it would be fun to kind of share some of these escapades or exploits with the reader. Although I have to say, my publisher said, maybe one or two stories about what happened when you smoked pot, is enough, not 4 or 5. So, understatement is probably better in this situation.
Yeah. My mother describes teenage years as the messy middle in life. And you describe some of that your messy middle in the book and quite like figuratively and literally from your job working as a dishwasher to cleaning the sludge of a popcorn machine at the movies to getting attacked by wasps while you're mowing grass one summer to fishing out golf balls from the water hazard. It struck me in your book that you're taking on these kind of typical summer jobs that one might have with kind of limited experience. And you talk about that in your book as well, is that like you kind of just jump into these experiences. And I also want to talk about later about how you kind of did similarly with becoming a Jesuit. So I'm wondering about that kind of risk taking that you tend to do and trying something new. How have you gotten kind of comfortable with being uncomfortable?
Well, I have to say, that's a very astute insight, and I have not thought about it ever until you brought it up, that the same way that I jumped into these summer jobs without much experience. I mean, I'd never set foot on a golf course before I was a caddy. I'd never set foot in a restaurant kitchen before I was a busboy. But you're right, I knew very little about the Jesuits, before I entered. So that's a very good insight. Interestingly, I don't consider myself a risk taker, right? I'm more of a risk-averse person. But I think things that I think will be fun or exciting or interesting, sort of draw me in. That was certainly the case with the Jesuits. With the jobs, I didn't think that being a busboy or dishwasher or a caddy was going to be fun. But I needed the money. And I think, when you're young, you have a certain sort of confidence and say, well, I can do this. And one of the phrases I say in the book, which I always thought to myself, was, well, how hard can that be? Right? It can't be that hard to be a caddy or a bank teller or a movie theater usher. And sometimes it was pretty hard. So I would say in the first case with my summer jobs, it was really a desire to make money and to sort of place myself or insert myself into these job situations. In the case of the Jesuits, I think it was more, I think this will be fun. I think this will be enjoyable. That kind of overcame my risk aversion, shall we say.
Were there moments as well that you got more comfortable also asking for help in those times where you might have felt overwhelmed with the task in front of you?
I think sometimes out of necessity, I needed to. That's one of the themes in the book, kind of life lessons learned. And one of the life lessons learned is, ask for help when you need it. It's okay not to know how to do something. I had a very strange a reaction when I felt that I couldn't do something. I felt sort of ashamed or foolish and embarrassed, when it doesn't make sense. How could a 15-year-old kid know how to use this industrial dishwasher or this mop or whatever, or pop the popcorn? And so it took me a while to realize that it's okay to ask for help, particularly at the beginning. No one expects you to be an expert. And I don't think I realized that until the Jesuits, right? Where our formation or our training is all about being thrown into new and different situations and having to ask for help and say, as like a hospital chaplain, I don't know what to do here. I need some help. So it's a path towards humility as well. But that's something that as I say in the book, I was kind of incapable of doing when I was 15 or 16. It took a while to get over that.
When you are kind of exploring your teenage self in this book, you have a line that I really liked and it really resonated with me. You said, one of my chief concerns was getting people to like me. I feel like a lot of teenagers go through, a lot of young adults, a lot of fully formed adults, if I'm being really honest. I think being liked and being approved of can dominate so much of our decision making in life. And I'm wondering how you kind of started to work through that and like how we can start letting go of the need to be liked, especially in the social media age where that's where everything is all about.
Yeah, I think I said one of my main concerns, probably the main concern that I had when I was a teenager or even in college or as a young adult was being popular, being seen as cool, right? Getting people to like you. I would imagine that's the experience of many, if not most teenagers. Eventually I realized, and it took a while, I think this is more when I was in the Jesuits, that trying to get everyone to like you is a fool's errand. You just can't do it. Not, some people will just not like you, and it may have to do with, something that you can't control, right? You remind them of someone they don't like, a relative, a neighbor, a friend, whatever. And I think sort of moving towards the freedom from the need to be loved, liked, or approved of is really one of the most important things in adulthood. Because if you only do things or say things or think things even, that you, in order to get people to like you, you're sort of paralyzed, right? And for me, the model was always Jesus, that, Jesus, puts up with people disliking him. And if he had, waited for everyone to approve of him, he would have never left Nazareth. He would have still been, sawing wood in Nazareth. So it's part of the path to adulthood. And I think, how do we do that? I think one of the ways is to recognize that not everyone's going to like you, right? And some people are going to dislike you and maybe even hate you, and that's okay. It doesn't mean you've done something wrong. It just means that, you're not to everybody's taste. But it took me a long time. That was kind of a lifelong quest to really sort of free myself of that.
Among the subject of being liked, of being approved of, I want to ask you about, in 2016, you started ministering to LGBTQ plus Catholics after the Orlando nightclub shooting, and you've received a lot of pushback against that. And I'm wondering if you could talk more about your efforts to support LGBTQ plus communities, both inside and outside the church.
Sure. As you say, it started in 2016 after the Pulse nightclub massacre. It led to, a Facebook video, which led to a talk, which led to a book called Building a Bridge, which led to both very positive reactions. It was basically inviting the Catholic Church, the institutional church, to reach out to the LGBTQ community in the wake of that murder. And that led to being invited by the Vatican to give a talk at a World Family Day meeting in Dublin, and then a meeting with Pope Francis, several meetings with Francis. And then we started this ministry called Outreach. And you're right, it's garnered a lot of critique, mostly support, right? Because most people know LGBTQ people and want to include them in the church. But yeah, particularly at the beginning, really venomous attacks on social media. I mean, name calling. The protests continue. And really, part of that is to ground yourself in the gospel message of inclusion and welcome. This is what Jesus did all the time. He's always reaching out to people on the margins. To remind myself that I have, the support of my Jesuit superiors. And, I recently met with Pope Leo, a couple months after he was elected. And that I think that this is the right thing to do. Again, though, not everyone's going to like me for that, right? And that really was a sort of litmus test for me, in terms of how comfortable I could be with people not only disliking me, but really hating me, right? And really, thinking I'm a demon, which I am not. I am not a demon. But it's, the irony of, my writing a book about, growing up as a teenager and a young adult with the primary concern of getting people to like me, right? The book's about, much more about that and a little more lighthearted. And then ending up in a ministry where, it's guaranteed that people are going to dislike you. It's kind of an interesting irony.
Was that an experience you felt prepared to take on?
I would say that I had a retreat a couple of years before I started doing the LGBT ministry, where I was praying about a passage in the Gospels called the rejection at Nazareth. And in that passage, Jesus stands up in the synagogue of Nazareth, his hometown, and he preaches and basically says, in so many words, I am the Messiah, in so many words. And initially, the townspeople, that Nazareth is a small town of about 200 or 400 people, praise him. But then they turn on him and they try to kill him, basically. They try to throw him off a cliff near Nazareth. And, Jesus, of course, escapes. But I remember in my prayer thinking, well, now, how could you do this? Like, how could you knew all these people in Nazareth. You knew if you stood up, they would sort of oppose you. And the words that came to me in prayer, not that I heard them, physically, but the words I imagined Jesus saying to me were, must everyone like you? And that was really powerful for me, because I realized, I think that was kind of still my goal, was to get people to like me. And it was a kind of invitation to move away from that. I thought, God's kind of inviting me to move away from that. And then a couple of years later, I started this LGBT ministry, not in response, but just in response to the Pulse massacre. And that retreat came back to me, and I thought, maybe this is part of it. Maybe God's inviting me to be free of that need in order to more freely minister to this community, who themselves are disliked and hated in many places. Mm. So that's what kind of enabled me to do that, to continue that kind of ministry.
How has those words, "must everyone liked you," expanded for you, if that makes sense?
Yeah, sure. Well, it's something I reflect on every day because almost every day I get pushback. Actually, that's probably an overstatement, not every day. But, for example, I gave a talk at my home parish outside of Philadelphia on the new book, Work in Progress, which is, set there. And so there were lots and lots of people. It was a lot of fun. But there were some protesters, which I thought was kind of crazy. It's a book about, growing up as a teenager in suburban Philadelphia. What is there to protest about? So I go back to that again. I always go back to this idea of, does everyone have to like me? And the answer is no, they don't. It's okay if people don't like me. And it gives you a lot of freedom. For example, if I were so upset about the protesters that I felt that I couldn't give the talk or that I needed to go out and convince them, right? I mean, that's the temptation. That would be really paralyzing. And, I don't do that because for many reasons. But so I just kind of move on. Mm. And that, as you say, that kind of deepens my desire for more and more freedom.
Today, we're listening back to my conversation with Father James Martin. His new book is Work in Progress. We'll continue our conversation with Father Martin after the break. This episode originally aired March 23rd, 2026. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Tess Terrible, Where We Live senior producer, in for Catherine Shen. Before becoming a Jesuit priest, Father James Martin was a dishwasher, a golf caddy, and even worked in Connecticut at General Electric. His new book is called Work in Progress. It explores the many professional experiences he had before becoming a priest. Let's jump back into the conversation. In the book, you describe, this one summer you ended up with multiple jobs. I think that's a pretty common experience for a lot of college kids. One of these jobs was working in a factory. And during this time, you got to know a lot of the other workers on the assembly line and their experiences. And you met people that were suffering true poverty. You met people that were immigrants. You met a Holocaust survivor. You minister to a lot of people in a lot of communities. And I'm wondering if you could talk about this experience, because among all the people you are reaching out to on the margins of society, I wondered if this summer was really a pivotal point for you.
That's a great question. So I was working at a factory called Sharp Packaging, and we were packaging pills, basically. And, I was on an assembly line, a literal assembly line, where you're just staring at boxes of pills sort of fly by. And I was working alongside, as you say, not only young people, but people for whom, this was their job, this was their career. Some of them quite poor, some of them, working class. And, also I stood next to a Holocaust survivor. I talk about that in the book and what that was like. I think what I learned was this sort of stunning variety of people that you are, part of the human race with, and that it come from so many different backgrounds, right? And it really challenged me to be open to different ways of looking at life, to different life paths, right? Different, ethnic, racial, socioeconomic backgrounds. And I feel that that's really helpful in the church today, because that's what the Catholic Church is, right? James Joyce says, "Here comes everyone." That's the Catholic Church. And you never know who you're going to run into, on the steps of the church, or what they're going to say, or what their backgrounds are. And so what's the point of what I'm saying? It's really taking people where they are. Right? Which is what Jesus did. He took people where they were, try to meet them where they are, try to understand them, try to give them the benefit of the doubt. So it's a kind of compassionate way of being with people. And I think that summer was the first time, sort of in a sort of an adult way, that I was thrown together with people from really different backgrounds than I had come from.
And it was a bit contrary to what you were experiencing in school. You write about how you were learning about capitalism and economics and, making these systems work for everyone. And then you're experiencing what poverty looks like up close. And I'm wondering if that was kind of the first kind of turning point for you, because up until that point, it felt like you were really all in on going into the business world. And I'm wondering if you could talk about that, of like when you started to feel maybe like going into business maybe wasn't the direction you were going to go.
I think that was later. When I was working at the factory, I was a college student. I was studying at the Wharton School of Business as an undergrad, studying finance. But that wasn't until later. I think at the time in the pill factory, when I was on the assembly line, it was an appreciation for people who were poor, and more a sense that, boy, I'm lucky that I'm not, in that situation. I want to work hard, right? I want to sort of do well. I had sympathy for those people, but it wasn't a kind of sort of reflection on capitalism. That didn't happen until later. And I think what really sort of forced it was not my time at Wharton, because that was, in a sense, a sort of deification, or at least a glorification of capitalism. I mean, I still think capitalism is the most efficient, way of sort of distributing goods and services. I would say I'm still a capitalist, but it has its flaws, right? And the flaws are seen by the people that the system fails. I don't think that really happened until my time at GE. Mm-hmm. And it was more that I didn't feel that I was in the right place in the business world. Business is a real vocation for a lot of people, right? I was working in Stamford, Connecticut at GE Capital, on Long Ridge Road. And I just thought, this isn't for me. The critique of capitalism per se, though, I think didn't happen until I entered the Jesuits, and I started to think about it and study it and think about what Pope Leo and Pope Francis called structural sin, right? That some systems, can themselves be unjust, right? Not just individuals, but a whole system can be unjust. That did not come until later. So the book reflects, kind of a later dawning on me, that the capitalist system is flawed, right, in the end.
Hmm. Something I noticed in your book is that, we get these little kind of previews of your journal entries when you're teenage, young adult years. And at some point you got, I believe it was an internship in stock brokerage. And it just struck me in your book, like reading your journal entry when you were working in stock brokerage, and it felt really different than your other entries. It felt very formal. It felt very kind of just outlining the day. It kind of was devoid from the same voice in life. In reading back those journal entries of what your early days in the business world looked like, can you tell now when you read back at those journal entries that like something wasn't exactly right?
Yeah, interestingly, the main journal that I was drawing from was the journal that I kept when I was 15, in 1976. The other sort of quotations, for example, when I was working at the stock brokerage, a discount stock brokerage, were from like resumes and notes and things that I had taken. And I think, I saw myself as much more of a serious business person, right? And, was trying to sort of fit that mold. So in a sense, it's not surprising that the language I would be using back then was much more business-oriented. And, Thomas Merton, the Trappist monk, talks about the false self and the true self. And I think I was becoming the false self. Again, business is a vocation for a lot of people. And a lot of my friends, spent their whole lives in business, their whole lives with GE, for example. But it wasn't something that was for me. And I think that I tried consciously to sort of make it something that was for me, if that makes sense. And so some of the language that I was using back then, doesn't feel like me because it wasn't me, right? I was trying to be kind of the business me, which really ended up not being the real me or the true self.
When did you start to recognize or maybe start to have language for that, like maybe that the language that you were in a period of discernment?
Well, I'm glad you asked that, particularly since it's about Connecticut. And I will say for your listeners, I was working at GE Capital in Stamford, Connecticut, and living in Stamford. And, it was an exciting time to be at GE. It was, the sort of go-go 1980s. But I eventually found that the work that I was doing, even though I was surrounded by many good people, was just not for me. And it was very stressful. And I also came into contact with a few managers, who I found were pretty immoral and sort of mean, basically. Again, not everybody, but enough that it bothered me. But it was mainly, I thought, I'm in the wrong place, and what am I going to do? And I'd studied business. I'd studied at Wharton. I, was a major in finance. And I didn't see a way out. And it wasn't until one night I came home and I turned on PBS, Channel 13, and there was a documentary about, again, Thomas Merton, the Trappist monk. And I thought, who is this guy? And what is this? And what is this monastic life? And what is religious life? And it was so captivating that it prompted me to go to a local shopping center. I think it was the Barnes & Noble or the Borders Books, and buy his autobiography. And that got me thinking about just changing my life. And I'll never forget, I went up to the pastor or one of the priests at St. Leo's Parish in Stamford. And I said a couple weeks later, I think I want to be a priest, based on just reading this guy's book. But again, it was so compelling and captivating and, almost romantic that it just sort of drew me. And that really was kind of the beginning of the call. This sense of this is really what I should be doing. This is what I feel like I'm more made to do.
Did that scare you at all?
Oh, sure. Yeah. And it was kind of a push and a pull. So it was a push out of GE, out of the corporate world, and a pull into this mysterious, romantic world of monasteries and religious life and prayer, which just seems so beautiful. It was a little scary because I didn't know anyone who had done that. I didn't know any priests. I didn't know any members of religious orders. And I'll tell you, when I told my family, they were horrified. And when I told one of my friends, my friend Chris Brown, who was a few years ahead of me in GE, what I was doing, I'll never forget it. He said, I think you need to see a psychiatrist. And I said, I am seeing a psychiatrist. And he said, I think you need to see another psychiatrist. So my friends thought I was kind of nuts. But it was so appealing, and the business world was so clearly not for me that those kind of concerns were sort of surmounted, I would say.
I think those moments in our life where we're making a transition and we're deciding to go another direction are never really clear cut, and they don't happen all at once. You have a line in the book that you said, I believed in God, but I didn't know if God believed in me. So among the fear, was there also doubt for you that this was something that you were really being called to take on?
Sure. I was really not prepared for life in the Jesuits, and I was sort of flying blind. I saw God as very distant. I believed in God. I believed God, in a sense, looked out for me in some sort of vague way. But the idea that, God would be calling me personally, and once again, I don't mean this in some mystical way or hearing voices, but that there would be this draw from God into the Jesuits, that was beyond me. Really what I was responding to in those days, this would have been 1985, 86, 87, was this desire to get out of GE and find something that's more appealing. So in a sense, it was almost like, finding a new job. The idea that God was behind this was something that it took me a while to really appreciate and believe, right? And kind of know in the end.
Why do you think you were attracted to the Jesuits specifically?
Well, funny. It's a funny story. I was at St. Leo's in Stamford, and the priest that I spoke with said this. I'll never forget it. I said, I think I'd like to be a priest. And he said, all right, well, you should talk to the local diocese, which, Diocese of Bridgeport. I said, okay. And you should talk to the diocese where you grew up, which is the Archdiocese of Philadelphia. And I thought, okay. And then he said, as an aside, you might as well talk to the Jesuits up at Fairfield, because he happened to know them. I think he was teaching a course at Fairfield or Fairfield Prep. And I thought, oh, okay, fine. So I drove up. I made an appointment to see some Jesuit, and he gave me this vocational literature, these pamphlets, what it means to be a Jesuit. And I remember thinking, oh my gosh, this is crazy. I could never do this. And I actually threw them out, and the Jesuits would continue to send me sort of recruiting literature. And I would stand outside near the mailbox on, Rock Spring Road in Stamford, where I was living with two roommates, and I would tear up the vocational stuff that they would send me. So it was just an aside. And eventually I just thought, gosh, I feel more at home with the Jesuits when I think about them. So I didn't do much research, frankly. I think my joke was, I think I did more research on, what kind of car to buy, but it worked. And I felt really at home with the Jesuits once I met them.
Mm. That seems like a big transition from ripping up the flyers you were getting from the Jesuits to deciding I'm going all in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was. And what happened was I was stressed at work. I had seen this Thomas Merton documentary, and eventually I got so stressed I was getting migraines and stomach problems and all this stuff. And someone said, you should see the employee assistance person, right? The EAP, like the in-house psychologist. And I did, and, she sort of sized me up and said, you're really stressed. You need to see a regular psychologist, which I did. And so I did that for a year or two. And eventually that psychiatrist, psychologist, who was living in Westport, Connecticut, said to me the words that changed my life. He said, well, why are you working at GE? And I said, well, what else am I going to do? He said, well, you could do anything. And I said, well, what else would I do? I have a business background. I've been working at GE for 6 years. I couldn't imagine doing anything else. I was pretty limited because I thought you got to work, right? You got to make a living. Now, what am I going to do? Be an opera singer or a baseball, player or something? And he said, well, what would you do if you could do anything you wanted to do? Which is a great question. And I said, oh, that's easy. I remember sitting in his office in Westport. I said, oh, that's easy. I would be a Jesuit priest. And he said, why don't you? And I thought, yeah, why don't I? What am I doing? So I went back and from my desk at GE, I called the Jesuits in Boston and said, I'm ready to enter. And they said, well, who are you? Right? Like, you're on our list, but we don't even know who you are. So that started the process. But it was that time in the therapist's office that enabled me to really see that I was in the wrong place. And that question, what would you do if you could do anything you wanted to do, is a really freeing and liberating and important question for everybody, I think.
So we are in a time right now in the Catholic Church where less and less people are entering the priesthood and consecrated life. That's not the only way to live a spiritual life, but those are certainly some ways. But what felt really important to me in reading your book is that we rarely ask the questions, what is the purpose of my life? What is it I really want to do with my life? Like, that's not usually part of the curriculum we are given. And I'm wondering how we start to introduce those questions, because, speaking for myself personally, those questions could have saved me a lot of time and given me a lot of more early direction in my life if they were introduced a little earlier.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think that those questions are the fundamental questions, right? Who am I? Who am I meant to be? And as one spiritual director said, not only who am I, but whose am I, right? I am God's, basically. I think one way to do it is to start with young people and to say, first of all, that you're created in a unique way. God loves you. You're a beloved child of God. Sometimes that can frighten people. Oh my gosh, I have to sort of figure this out. But it's really about paying attention to your desires, what appeals to you, what interests you, where your skills are. And to say that we don't have to be cookie cutter versions of everybody else, right? I think a lot of the desire to fit in and the desire to be liked, which we talked about before, is in a sense almost a desire to be like everyone else, right? And so compare ourselves to other people, and we always sort of find ourselves wanting, right? And so that sort of diminishes us in our own minds. But it's really understanding that we're all beloved, we're all created with a certain purpose and a certain set of gifts and talents and challenges, and to really celebrate that. But really, I think key is asking people those questions at a young age, and saying that you might have a vocation to be, a radio show host, right? I might have a vocation to be a Jesuit priest. Both are equally important and equally, valuable. But, there's so much emphasis on, everybody has to make money, right, and earn a living. But the emphasis, I think, is so much on status and money and power that we forget the simpler things about, as I said, who are you and whose are you?
I want to go back to what you said about introducing these questions to young people, because reading your book made me reflect a lot on what college students are going through today, the pressure to be perfect, this endless competition to get into the best school with every extracurricular activity on their resume. And then when they're going to break into the job market, there's even more competition. And at the same time, we're seeing Gen Z young adults go to church more than any prior generations. That's according to research from Pew. And I'm wondering if you could talk about that, of like when you're in conversation with young adults today, asking those questions, or maybe when you're in conversation with educators, kind of encouraging them to ask those questions outside, what do you want to be when you grow up?
It's funny you should say that, because last night I was speaking to a classroom of college students at a Jesuit college out in California, and a lot of them brought that up, right? The competitiveness, how do I find what I want to do, mm-hmm. the sort of pressures that they feel. Why are Gen Z young adults going to church? I think someone described it to me as post-secular, right? Mm-hmm. So maybe a generation ago, we talked about post-Christian, right? The Christian values aren't sort of speaking to people, and we're not living in a sort of Christian environment. We're post-religious, more broadly, I would say, because obviously we're lots of different religions, but a kind of post-religious generation. I think what's going on, is that, people in that generation and younger generations are finding the secular world wanting, mm-hmm. right? It's just not giving them what they need and what they want and what they desire, which is meaning and purpose, and, also a sense of mystery and awe and belief. So there is this, I can see it. I mean, I've seen the statistics, but also anecdotally, I know a lot of Jesuit priests who are at, Boston College or Fairfield or Georgetown or St. Joe's or Fordham, saying that, my gosh, there's so many young people at Mass these days, right? So something's going on. So I think it is this kind of dissatisfaction with secularity. But in a more basic way, I think everybody has a natural desire for God. I think that God plants that within us. And so they're responding to that as well. So it's not just young people who would feel that desire to be with God. It's older people as well. I think you're right, though. I think the pressures that younger people are feeling from, a sort of diminished economy and also social media really makes them look for something else, right? Something that's a little more meaningful, right? Than just kind of comparing yourself to everybody on Instagram, right? Or on TikTok.
We have listeners of all faith traditions who tune in to Connecticut Public Radio. And, we started this conversation and you did the quote, everyone's life is a spiritual journey. Is there a piece of advice that you give to people in any faith tradition in all seeking stages of their spiritual journeys?
Yeah, I think it's pay attention, notice. A lot of spirituality is just about noticing where God already is in your life, right? And that's no matter what faith tradition you are. Oftentimes people think priests or Jesuits are all about bringing God to people and saying, this is, we're not going to sort of impose God on you. But it's more a gentle way of turning people's attention to where God already is in their lives, because God's in everybody's life. It's just a question of noticing. I had a good friend, Father Bob Gilroy, who died at an early age. And he used to say, I love this expression. He used to say, people have experiences of God frequently. They're just not encouraged to talk about them. Mm. Isn't that great? I mean, so it's sort of eliciting from them these experiences and saying, let's talk about that and take it seriously. And it wasn't just some strange emotional thing that happened to you or some strange insight. Can you consider that might be God sort of, in a sense, communicating with you? So again, encouraging people to notice and be aware and pay attention to those experiences, I think, is really an important step. And that's no matter what faith journey you're on. Hmm.
We've talked a lot about formation today in a lot of different forms. I do want to pause and acknowledge that we're recording this interview just 2 weeks after you lost your mother to pneumonia, and she was 94 years old. Learning about her was one of my favorite parts of your book because she was a formidable Sicilian woman with a big heart and a sense of humor. I have a lot of those women in my life. In the acknowledgments of your book, you thank both of your parents for instilling a work ethic in you. But I'm wondering, in these last few weeks since your mother has died, have there been any other revelations on how your mother has influenced your work in life?
Well, I would say that, well, certainly those acknowledgments land a lot differently now, right? For me. As you say, she died just 2 weeks ago, and I celebrated her funeral mass in our home parish, which was a very moving experience for me. I think the revelation for me came when I was writing the funeral mass homily. My mother, as I say in the book, was a great worrier and would always say, "Oh, be careful of this, be careful of that." And I think before she died, I used to think of it as negativity, right? Like, stop worrying so much. And I would tell her that, stop worrying so much. You're going to get poison ivy if you do this. Be careful of Doberman pinchers. They're really dangerous. Be careful of, getting stung by a bee. You could go into shock. I think after her death, I realized it was a form of love. And the reason that she was, in a sense, a worrier, right, or was always, as I saw it, looking at the negative side of things, was that she was trying to protect us. And that literally did not dawn on me until she died, until I was writing that funeral homily. That was a form of love, don't drink from the backyard hose, wash your hands when you come in from the outside. All these things that my mom would say that I would roll my eyes at were a form of love because she wanted to protect my sister and me. And that was really helpful for me and really kind of a surprise, I would say. I mean, a real surprise because, I consider myself fairly reflective. I've gone to therapy for a while. I think I kind of know as they say, my family of origin. But that grace didn't come until after she died, to really understand her in that way and to see her as a worrying person, as really a loving person. And for her, those two things went hand in hand.
I want to end by asking you a quote about that you write from your dad. He says, "Work isn't supposed to be fun. Why do you think they call it work? If it were fun, then they'd call it play." I'm curious, as you continue your work as a Jesuit, as you support communities on the margin, how do you feel about this saying today?
Well, my dad, I start the book off with 2 epigraphs. That's one from my dad, which he would say regularly, of course it's not fun. Why do you think they call it work? And my mom's line, which I put at the front of the book, is about summer jobs. Well, you're not going to sit inside all summer, that's for sure, right? You mean to get out and get a job. My dad's insight has helped me because sometimes work is hard. Right? And often work is hard. And even the work that I do today, which is writing and working for America Media and, doing these podcasts and, helping the LGBTQ community can be tough, meaning, and I don't just mean in terms of pushback or opposition. I mean, it's hard work, getting up and, putting in the slog and sitting at your computer and meeting people, and it can be tiring. And I think that really helped me just as a working person. I'm still working, right? I still have a job, and as we Jesuits, rarely retire. I'll probably be working until they put me in the ground. But my dad's work ethic and my mom's work ethic really prepared my sister and me, I think, for the real life, the real world, right? Because it can be hard. Again, why do you think they call it work? It's funny, that was almost the title of the book. Why do you think they call it work? The other title of the book was also rejected, was Misspent Youth. But my publisher thought that it would sound like I was kind of negative about what went on before. But yeah, my dad's wisdom and my mom's wisdom have really helped me a lot in life. And truly, it's not until these recent years that I've been able to see that.
Any final thoughts for our listeners before we close?
Gosh, I would say I hope you enjoy the book. It's pretty lighthearted, right? We've been talking about some serious things here, but for the most part, it's pretty lighthearted. And I hope it helps you to see where God's been at work in your life as well, no matter what kind of, where you are, what kind of work you're doing, or even if you're doing no work, that if God can be at work in the life of a 15-year-old busboy, he can certainly be at work in your life too.
Thank you so much, Father Martin.
My pleasure.
That was Father James Martin. His new book is Work in Progress. You can find out more information on his book by visiting our website at ctpublic.org/wherewelive. I'm Tess Terrible. Today's show was produced by myself and editor Patrick Scahill. Our technical producer is Dylan Reyes. Download Where We Live anytime on your favorite podcast app. Thanks so much for listening.